Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Polynesian Eyes podcast. This is your host, Tua Fale. I will be lone rangering today. Mr. Atearoa is tied up with some responsibilities, and we're kicking off the weekend right. Been a busy week at work, and it looks like it's been so for Mr. Atearoa. Today, we're going to continue with our series on the Polynesian Eyes podcast regarding William Mariner. We're going to go and continue to watch and react to our friend Kawa University's review and summaries of the chapters of the William Mariner book. So that's what we're going to jump in today. We appreciate all the support that everyone's given. We are very grateful and we're excited for the feedback, the response, the interactions with all the viewers and the listeners. And so, really want to thank everyone. Goes a long way when we get a share, a like, a subscription. So please, if you feel that there's some value being added to you, please go ahead, share, subscribe, and send over any content that you may be interested in. With that being said, we're going to continue with the series. And here we are with Kava University. Let me change the view here. I think we're going to go with this one.
When I say story time, I'm talking about this is what Mariner heard as a story from either Finau or from Tuponiua or from other chiefs or from other people on the island. Mariner took all the common denominators or the commonalities of each story and he put it together himself from hearing it from everybody else. We're going to get into Fiji now. 10 to 15 years before Mariner shows up, Tonga has always gone to Fiji for sandalwood. So the sandalwood oil and the sandalwood, whatever they use it for, whether it's lotions or things for the skin or for sores or for fragrance, they got a lot of sandalwood from Fiji. A lot of the war weapons to kill men were learned at this time from the Fijians, according to the Tongans at this point in time. They had bow and arrows that killed rats and birds and little things, and they had little spears also that did that. According to whoever was telling Mariner, whether it was Finau or the other chiefs, a lot of the man-killing bows and arrows and the spears, they learned how to build that from the Fijians. The Fijians at this point in time were at war with each other. He was told that there were 4 or 5 giant forts or garrisons in Fiji where
Yeah, I really want to comment on that real quick. I mean, this is very, very important to recognize. Why was Tonga not as advanced in warfare? And this comes back to a couple things. Number one, it is the stability of society in Tonga because there was strong structure and there is a pre-existing and really mature government, social structure, and economic stability, that war is not a function of high stability in leadership, high social structure, and also economic safety. So I think this is a window into understanding that there was long periods of stability in Tonga. And that's why warfare is not at the level that is experienced in Fiji. You go to Fiji, the reason why warfare is developed because there is consistent and constant war. That could be because of, you know, high competition for resources, instability of government and social structure, whatever you want to call it, it's instability. And that is a huge difference between the two cultures in that day. Now, this also comes back to the other concept that many have the idea, or at least have expressed the idea online, that the Tuitonga maintained and executed power through military conquering. There seems to be some oral history, specifically around Kaulufonua Fekai, where military force seems to have played maybe a bigger role. But it seems that when you zoom out, that Tonga's influence and structure that was shared with throughout the Polynesian Empire was through religious matters in regards to Tangaloa and also to the Tuitonga. There was also familial ties. the Tuitonga and Tangaloa marrying throughout Polynesia and maintaining relationships with ruling families throughout these islands spread throughout Polynesia. And so, really, those are the two interesting things that stick out to me when you hear the description that William Mariner is learning from these stories, because the instability and the warfare that he's describing is not the standard or the norm in Tonga. That's why the weaponry and the warfare is not as advanced as it would be in Fiji.
They would actually attack each other and go to war with each other. The Tongans would show up and get whatever they needed, but they were never involved in those wars for the most part. The Fijians taught them how to build the bows and arrows and the spears. They taught them how to use them, to throw them, the ones that killed human beings, because that's what they were good at. That's what they did often. That's what they did all the time. And he said that there were Tongans in Fiji that lived amongst, but around, for the most part, around these tribes and these wars and whatnot. Some of them had families and relations that lived there, but they were never involved, not directly, not as a people. There were men that showed up to Fiji and joined some of the different tribes that went to war with each other, but they went together, right? They would go and join a tribe, and they would go pillage and plunder, and they would fight, and then they would leave and come back and join a different group, and they would move around like that. They learned how to paint their faces and paint their bodies and dress like the Fijians, and there's a lot of things that the Tongans appreciated, especially the young ones, right? The young warriors and the young chiefs appreciated about the Fijians because they thought that they loved that Fiji maxim. It was very masculine to them. A lot of the young guys looked up to things like that. And for the most part, any involvement that most of the Tongans had in Fiji and their wars were the young ones who wanted to be a part of that. Captain Cook described when he was in Niue, he saw a lot of that behavior. A lot of the dances of the Tongans in Niue mimicked a lot of the war dances, behaviors, and war-like moves of Fiji. He would sit and often talk to some of the old folks in Tonga. He would ask them where the Fijians came from, or how is it that they were to become part of this group of islands. And even the old ones. He said one of the older ones looked like he was in his 80s, which means he was born in the 1720s or 30s. And even he said, oh no, we don't know. We assumed that a ship rolled by and they drifted him over here into Polynesia or into Fiji, and they ended up staying there. Other than that, we've always been there, and they showed up and they start fighting each other. But you can tell the distinct difference in how they look. They were.
I think there's some things that are interesting, and I remember reading it somewhere, something very similar to what Kava University is sharing, where there is an account, and I couldn't put my finger on it, and maybe it's from an older version because there's multiple versions of William Mariner's book, and he may have an older one. But I remember reading that one of the Tongans had shared the account that Tongans were there before Fijians arrived and settled in the islands. I couldn't find it unless I'm misunderstanding what Kava University is sharing here. That's what I've heard in some other things as well. What he's sharing about the youth in the interest in war is very true. There are a lot of stories, oral stories, and pretty much accepted history that as the young Tongan warriors would go to Fiji, they were seeking after that, if you want to call it entertainment, that masculine approach, because back in Tonga, it was relatively peaceful nonstop. There were no wars, at least consistent or constant war, to result in sophisticated weaponry and development in the art of war. Now, the Tongans would go to Fiji and they would participate and learn and do all the raiding. And there are stories that when these young men would come back to Tonga, they would be bored living in Tonga because they were bored of just the peace, and they were seeking after that rush, that basically it's like that adrenaline rush that war gives you. And they would many times cause issues in Tonga by stealing from each other to set up and try to stir problems in war to seek after it. And many of them wanted to participate that on a constant basis. There are even stories of young Tongan chiefs who on their deathbeds would ask, you know what, let's go to Fiji. because they felt that they were going to die soon, and they would have preferred to go to Fiji and die in war than to die in peace in Tonga. So this is found throughout many stories throughout Tonga, and it shows a big contrast in the social structure over a long period of time. I do want to emphasize that the lack of sophistication of the weaponry in the art of war amongst the Tongans is a symbol of prosperity, of peace, of order, and of structure over many generations. And that is usually what leads to that. Now, when there is lack of structure, when there is lack of economic opportunity, where there is no religious or social binding, that's when you head to war. And eventually Tonga went through that. But I do want to just really highlight that, because that could give us great insight how the Tui Tonga and Tangaloa managed the empire, and also to show that Tonga overall, that stability may have played a big role in how Tonga was able to maintain independence throughout the colonization of the world and the Pacific.
Darker. They had frizzy hair. They gauged on their bodies. They gauged their lips. They gauged their pierced their
I did
cheeks
not
or
know
their
that they
nose or
gauged.
their ears gauged, and they obviously looked different. That's why Mariner was curious who they were and where they came from, and that's all the old folks can tell him. That they assumed that they were on a ship and it drifted into Fiji, and that's where they ended up staying and living, continuing their war-like, behaviors, one tribe against the other. A lot of these stories come from a guy named Tui Halafatai. Finau tells him about Tui Halafatai. Finau actually knew Tui Halafatai. This was before Mariner even got there. He knew Tui Halafatai and his escapades in Fiji. And he goes on to tell him a story about Tui Halafatai in Fiji. And he heard it from a few different chiefs. And he took the similarities of all the stories and put it together about Tui Halafatai. Between the time of Captain Cook and Mariner, there was a point in time where there was peace in Tonga. Everybody lived peacefully, according to Finau and the other chiefs. During this time, there's a guy named Tui Halafatai who was he calls it an unquiet disposition. He just wanted to go do stuff. He convinced a whole bunch of young guys and a whole bunch of young.
And this is a very recognized personality, even amongst Polynesians in general, but I can, especially in Tonga, there's always a character who just wants to stir up situations. And this may be true across all cultures, probably, that while everyone's having a good time, relaxing, enjoying, whether it's the scenery or the people, there's always a small group of people who say, that's not enough. And they want more excitement, if you want to call it. So Tui Halafatai seems to be that type of individual. And this may be what I was mentioning earlier. It sounds like this is the type of individual that the stories have of going to Fiji, loving the excitement, comes to Tonga, gets bored, and wants to cause issues.
Chiefs and warriors to do the same. So they go into the main storehouse of the village or the town or the island, probably, and they rob it. They all promise an oath to each other that they'll never betray each other, they'll never go against each other, and they create a group. And this group that Tui Halafatai creates, they go and they rob the storehouse. They didn't need any of it. It's food and mats and ngatu and tapa and everything, but
this is exactly some of that oral history that I was referencing earlier. It's probably a lot of memories from when I read that book. I mean, I read William Mariner's book probably 15 years ago. So that's where it's coming from. It looks like, sounds very familiar.
They didn't need any of it because they all owned things. They all had whatever they needed.
Yeah,
the next day, the whole village or the whole island is surprised. They're wondering who stole this, who could have robbed them of these
and
things.
Why.
And then it occurs to Tuhafatai, or at least he tells them, this may have been training for them, but he tells them, hey, I know a place where we can go where they're at war with each other all the time. Fiji, Heka, let's jump in the ships and go to Fiji. He said he gathered around 250 men, 3 giant ships or 3 giant canoes with sails, and they sailed to Fiji. And that's exactly what they do.
This is the word of caution. When there is an unexpected or out of nowhere situation or problem, be very leery of the first person who comes up with a solution or an idea. Because many times, in my experience and observations, the one who miraculously comes up very quickly with a solution may very well be the one who caused the problem. So this is true in personal life. This is true in communal life. This is true on a national level or an international level. When something out of the ordinary happens or a situation happens, be wary of who immediately comes with a quick solution or a quick idea, and everybody's like, "Oh yeah, that's great." It may be because they are the ones who caused that problem and they're trying to cause a problem to achieve their goals. And for those who are members of the church, what he's really mentioning there is what we would call a secret combination, right? Come in, they pledge allegiance to each other, agree to do things for money and power and influence. And that's basically what they did there.
They go over and there's 4 or 5 giant garrisons there of people, Fijians going to war with each other. They show up to a place called Laemba or Lemba. I'm not sure. I looked it up in Fiji. It wasn't in Fiji. I did find a Lemba, but it was in West Africa somewhere, Southwest Africa. So anyway, they show up into Fiji. They join one tribe. They go to war with another tribe. These are the guys that were of an unquiet disposition. They were just wanted to go. They thought that living a peaceful, easy life was for the weak. It was for the feminine, where these guys wanted to go and get a taste of war with people by going and fighting, by going and pillaging and plundering. So they join one tribe, and the tribe that they're fighting against, they go and fight, they pillage, plunder, they go to war, kill, whatever, and they bring everything back, whether it's animals, everything they own, even their women. Which I would imagine, if that was the case, then they immediately started breeding with them then, because they ended up being there for 2.5 years or so, which means a lot of warlike activity after warlike, the days of war and battle. What better thing to come home to than something soft? Ooh. That's just an assumption of my judgments as far as if they were there that long.
I mean, it's a fair description, right? When you're young, you're seeking after this masculine type of conception in your mind that is not necessarily accurate, but we all know the stereotype of that thinking and that type of approach and that type of life. Yes. When you're living like you don't know when you're going to be, whether you'll be alive tomorrow because you're going to war, I think that's a very safe bet from Kava University's perspective.
And they were taking everything from them, including, women, then it would only make sense that they started breeding with them if they were there for 2.5 years or more. Then the tribe that they just beat, they would leave the tribe that they were with, they would leave them and join a different tribe. Sometimes they would join the tribe that they would just beat just to go back and fight the ones that they left. And they would go at each other. Then they would join another team. After they fight, they would join another team. Eventually,
basically they're just going around these Tongans and they just want war, right? That's all they want. They're bored. They have this misconception of what masculinity really is. Just because you can go and beat up a bunch of people, it doesn't mean you should go and beat up a bunch of people, right? That there's a lot more to life than enforcing your physical prowess on others. That's a very one-dimensional approach to life, but it can be very tempting, especially when you're young, especially when you're trying to develop a worldview. This is where certain ideas like communism and stuff, they at first gets hold of the mind of the youth and then it spreads. This is no different than some of the ideas that we're facing in our day. Granted, it's not as obvious in the physical confrontation, but it'll start with ideas, it will start with words, and then it will eventually turn to physical conflict.
They broke off and they became their own little unit, and then they started going to battle with each tribe all on their own. That happened for a couple years, 2.5 years or so, and then they finally got tired of war, and then they sailed back. But when they sailed back, the 3 giant canoes that they sailed in, they left those there and they took the nicer built, beautiful giant canoes that the Fijians built. Took 3 of those and came back. That was just a story from what Mariner took from all the stories he heard about Tui Haufatai from Finau and the other chiefs and the other people that were there in Hapai at this time. Keep that Tui Haufatai and the Fijian warriors and everybody, everything that happened in Fiji in mind, because that's going to go into the next story. Before Tui Haufatai's time, there was a man named Toku'aho. Now, I've only heard Toku'aho's name in history. The history that I've learned, the history that I know. Tupuaho, who was the father of Tupou To'a, who was the father of King George Tupou I. So Tupuaho succeeds to the throne, and not everybody likes him. I mean, it's far from it, because Tupuaho was a bully. He was very vindictive. He was cruel, a cruel king, a cruel leader. Tupuaho, during a kava ceremony in the afternoon, he gathered his cooks. 12 men, gathered them together doing the kava ceremony, and he chopped off their arms from here down. 12 of them. That's the type of mentality Tuku'aho had. And it was this type of behavior, and many like it, that basically laid the groundwork for an insurrection.
And this is where, yes, this is where things kind of go bad and things can go wrong very quickly, especially when you have leadership that's been in power for hundreds to thousands of years. You develop a disconnect from reality and the role and responsibilities of, and especially in the, when the Tui Tonga creates the Tui Hatakalaua, then the Tui Tonga's pushing off responsibilities of administrative, the burdensome tasks of being king. And then the Tui Hatakalaua does it and gives it to the Tui Kanukupolu. And so then you have 3 separations from your responsibilities. You turn into an oppressor. And that may be the reasons why the Tui Tonga, the instability and the issues that rise from that is trickling throughout the Polynesian Empire, that leads to the same thing. When you have a leader who behaves in this manner and doesn't keep his end of the social contract, everything falls apart and you get resistance.
Or a revolution. He was a mean man, and he always wanted to exert his authority and show it off so that people will see how powerful he is and how much authority he has. That's the mentality Tupuaho had. Tupou Niua, who was a tributary chief in Vava'u at this time, he felt the bullying. He felt very oppressed by Tupuaho, because Tupuaho is getting tribute from the other islands, from Hapai, from Finaukalala, and from Vuna, who was in Vava'u, but Tupou Niua was also a tributary chief in Vava'u at this time under Vuna. Tupou Niua heard about the story about the amputations of Tuku'aho's cook's arms, and he put it in his mind that he's going to kill Tuku'aho. He's going to rid himself of the oppression. He's going to free himself from Tuku'aho's grasp or leadership, or he's going to die in the process. That's what he relayed over to Finau, Urukalala. He told Finau is his brother. And he told Finau, look, a lot of times he planned it. He told Finau, look, I'm going to go kill Tuku'aho with or without your help. I'm going to free us from his oppressive nature. Finau would often say, all right, cool, yeah, that sounds good. That sounds like a plan. He was basically encouraging him without being absolutely involved yet. So during the annual tribute, Tupou Niua brings his tribute from Vava'u, sent over typically by Vuna, if he was the leader. He sailed down with his men, picked up Finau Urukalala and Finau Urukalala's tribute and his men, and they sailed to Tonga for the tribute, the annual tribute. We all know what these celebrations look like when you're celebrating something, right? You bring the tribute, there's a celebration, there's dance, there's music, there's food and everything. Everybody's off their guard. Finau and Tupou Niua are there with their tribute. It's a party. They have kava and everything else. They bring their tribute in the form of taking things like in a funeral, like, right? We call it a hala. We take things and we present it to the person we're taking it to. They do all that. The night comes and celebration's over, and everybody retires to their place of sleep and rest, knowing that the celebration is over, and the next day they're going to sail back to Hapai and Vava'u. Once everything has died out that night, Finau said it was around midnight. Finau gets his men, Tupou Niua gets his men, and they all go towards the house of the king. Tukuaho. Finau sets his guys up on the outside, and he watches the outside as guards. Tuponiua's guys go up, and they're waiting at the doorway for a sign. Tuponiua goes in there, and he's looking for Tukuaho, knowing Tukuaho's asleep somewhere. So he walks through, and the thing that he remembers is the scent of the sandalwood, the scent of the flowers. And he looks and sees the lines of the women, his concubines and his wives, laying about the house. And he thinks to himself, what a waste it's going to be that every one of these women are going to have to die. What a waste it's going to be, because these are the most precious or the most beautiful that we have here in Tonga. Young women, some perhaps maybe have children already, but all he can see is those women laid in the house. He walks to the back of the house where Tukuaho is laying on a mat asleep. Tuponiua stands there for a couple seconds and looks down at him, and he's both finds the joy of the fact that he's going to kill this bully, kill this tyrant, and the heat of anger he has because he has hurt so many people, so many of his people, so many of their people. And instead of immediately killing him, he thought to himself that at the very least he should know who's killing him. And he leans down and he slaps him right on the cheek. And Tukuaho.
I love that video, that picture of Will Smith uh, and Chris Rock. That was hilarious on that slap. Good one, Lolo. That was hilarious.
Gets hit and he kind of moves up to sit up, lay up. Immediately Tuponiua backs up and he grabs the axe and he swings and cracks his head open with an axe. As soon as that happened, the men see and hear what has happened. Tuponiua's men enter and they start killing all the women that were laying there. Everybody that was in the house. It was a bigger home, a bigger fare, and everybody had to die. Because as we learned with the story about the missionaries, if you were to kill somebody, their relations and everybody who's close to them would have to die too, just so that they don't have to face retaliation later in the future. Everybody has to die. That's the custom of killing in Tonga at this time, which makes perfect sense. Because if you leave anybody...
That's really unfortunate, but that is the ugliness of war. Woo! You know, it's crazy. Maybe they're making sure there are no witnesses. They're trying to wipe everything out. It's really, really brutal. That's crazy.
Alive, there are going to be those who are going to want to retaliate, and then they're going to build their own army and come after you. On Tuponiua's way out, there was an infant child that he thinks was 3 years old. He picks him up, grabs him, and he takes him with him and ends up adopting that kid. Everybody goes throughout the house and kills everybody, and then they leave. They go to hahake. Hahake means...
I think that's that is an interesting cultural thing that Polynesians, and also I've seen heavily with Tongans, is that, I mean, that's literally what William Mariner was the beneficiary of Polynesians and Tongans, which are, one and the same, but that, here you are and you're going to save. I mean, it has some level of humanity. Maybe didn't have the heart to kill the child. But it's interesting. That is something that I definitely see as a practice of Polynesians, always willing to adopt and to integrate others into their family. Even in these bizarre type of situation as this, as if, we're slaughtering everybody. I just killed your mother, but I'll take you. And they don't take them as a slave. They adopt them into their family. Interesting. I don't have a lot of knowledge into what drives that practice, but I do see it pretty heavily, which is kind of unusual in my mind. If anybody has any insight into how and why that practice was adopted, put in the comments or give us a link to a video that may explain that, and we can dig into it further.
It's upper Tonga. Tukuaho stays in Hihifo somewhere. Mariner doesn't say where, he just says that he's in Hihifo. We have heard stories about kings and champions and hows or whatever that stayed in Hihifo, but we don't really know when and where exactly they stayed. But Mariner said that Tukuaho stayed in Hihifo somewhere. How it's divided up now, I'm not sure. I do know that there's Hahake and Hihifo and Vaheloto, which is the middle of Tonga, and those divisions. But at this point in time, the only thing he mentions is Hahake and Hihifo, upper and lower. And Tukuaho stayed in lower. If Tukuaho is George Tupo I's grandfather, and George Tupo the First, Taufa'ahau the First, he was born somewhere in Baheloto, right? Near Liahona. Come to find out, Tuaho lives somewhere near a beach in Hifo. And this beach, the canoes can pull up onto the beach, onto shore. So it couldn't have been anywhere near where the coral reefs are. Like if you went to Matahau and went to the beach, it couldn't have been that because they said they pulled all the way up into the beach because Matahau doesn't have the beach. It's just a big coral reef. And a lot of Tongas like that. They just have coral reef. Well, there's a beach in Hihifo somewhere that they came to and they sailed around to when they did all this. So they escaped to Haake. The next morning, there's a lot of confusion. Everybody's running around wondering what happened. People telling the stories of what happened, what they heard or what they know. Old men were running around and standing in front of groups and telling people to either avenge their chief. At this time, also the conch shell, that big shell that all I've known to have been a Hawaiian thing, they were blowing that all over the island to indicate that the island is at war. The king is dead. Now it's time for everybody to group up and get into their groups or into their tribes to fight or to go to war, either for the king or just to protect their families or to stay out of it. Some people weren't even involved.
As we mentioned earlier, right? When there's chaos and loss of structure, it leads to war. That's the natural outcome.
Divided Tonga at this point in time when Tuguaho died. There was a lot of division, a lot of groups. Because at the same time, just like I said, he was a bully. Tuguaho, there's a lot of people that didn't like him. But Tupo Niwa and Finau knew that they had to kill at least the most loyal to him, the ones that might retaliate. There are a lot of them that considered Tuaho king and considered him the leader and the high chief. Some of them didn't even mind that he died. Some of them just stayed home and just protected their families and didn't want to get involved in the war. Besides, Finau Lugalala and Tupo Niwa are on their way back. They're coming to kill everybody that was close to him. They're going to bring their armies. So although they retreat to Hahake, they sail back down on their canoes to Hihifo. That's why I said that the palace at one point in time was in Hihifo near the beach, because Meredith said it was a quarter mile or 3/4 miles from the beach or into Hihifo, but they pulled their canoes all the way in, destroyed the canoes that were there, but kept their canoes there. They fought with some guys that were on the beach, destroyed their canoes, and then they moved inward in Hihifo. They get into a battle. They start fighting each other. The most loyal to Tuguaho, Finau and his men, and Tuponiwa and his men, they all went.
And this is the probably the driver on why Tupo the First never directly attacks Laufiri Tonga, the last Tuitonga, because it leads to this type of fracturing in the country, because now everybody's got to make a decision. Now you're going to be loyal to the Tuitonga, you're going to be loyal to Tupo the First, which is the fracturing that we see there. This is why he didn't make that direct attack. And this is also why it's critical that Laufiri Tonga does not make a challenge to Tupo the First either, because that would undermine the government that Tupo the First is building, the constitution, the trying to build treaties with foreign powers to maintain Tongan sovereignty. And so this is what Tupo the First and Laufiri Tonga, depending, either one of them, overextends themselves and leads the country to chaos. This is what would have happened to Tonga, and then Tonga would have been colonized, no doubt. This is why I find it quite intriguing that these two men, without, whether maybe they had direct consultation with each other, but it doesn't seem to be the case, that independently they ended up working out a situation and a structure that benefited the people as a whole and maintained the sovereignty of the Kingdom of Tonga to this day.
To battle with Tukuaho and his men and his loyalists and those people who are really loyal to him, fighting for their chief or for their king. I've kind of already went over the fact that these guys might all be related because Tupo Niwa is Finau's brother. We also know that the Tupos are where Tukuaho is from because his son is Tupo Toa, and Tupo Toa ends up having Tupo George I, who unifies all of Tonga under the British protection. So we're looking at this more of a family affair, a family fight. So after their first battle, Finau Galala, Tupo Niwa, and their men, after their first battle in Hihifo, they actually get beat back. They do a lot of killing and whatnot. They're killing back and forth, and they get beat back. go back to Hahake. This is where Tui Halafatai and them come back in. Because while they're in Hahake, two giant Fijian-built canoes, nice ones, show up, which happens to bring back Tui Halafatai and the Fiji
War
warriors he took
hardened
to
guys.
Fiji mercenaries, if you will. They get to where they are. Tui Halafatai and his men join Finau and Tupou Niwa. They get together. They obviously know each other, and Tui Halafatai is down to take his men and join together with Finau Ukalala and Tupou Niwa.
How fortunate, right? You get basically guys been out for 2 years straight. They probably have advanced weaponry, familiar with warfare strategy, and just the courage to just move forward and not stop. Very fortunate timing.
To go back to Hihifo and fight Tukuaho's men and battle with Tukuaho's loyalists. They meet together and they talk about how they're going to go to Hifo and go to war, right? They're going to go to battle. They give the whole plan. They're going to get up. They're going to get ready, prepare everything. And then early morning or early afternoon, they're going to march back down to Hifo just so that they can take out the main guys, the main loyalists of Tukuaho so that they don't retaliate. During that meeting that evening, Tui Halafatai tells them that he feels ill. He's been feeling ill for a while. He may have been feeling ill while they were in Fiji, and that illness has followed him over the ocean back to Tonga. And Tui Halafatai tells Finau, I don't think my illness is going to let me last too long. I don't want to lay in bed with this illness and die slow. Let's go earlier. Let's go before the sun comes up. Let's go right at the crack of dawn so that at the very least I can die in battle. Let's go early so that I can die in battle.
That's really how these guys were really chasing that adrenaline rush. That is what, quote unquote, bloodthirsty looks like. Hardened warriors who yearn for battle is basically what I'm understanding from this. And boy, are Ulukalala and Tuponiwa fortunate these guys showed up, because it looks like they were on the verge of either being killed or chased back to the outer islands, and then eventually Tukuaho's men coming to the outer islands after them.
So just before the sun comes up, Finau Ugalala, his men, Tupou Niwa, his men, now Tui Halafatai, and the warriors from Fiji, the Fiji mercenaries, they get together and now they sail back around to Hihifo on that beach. They get to the beach. Remember, it's an area in Hihifo that has the beach where they can pull into. They destroy the canoes that are there and they have a little battle on the beach. They go into Hihifo and they start fighting. Finau describes how vicious and how savage Tui Halafatai and his men were. They were good to go. They just came back from Fiji. They came back from battling all the time with the Fijians, and now it has become their occupation. So they're ready. They jump into the battle, and Finau describes a little bit how Tui Halafatai and his men, how vicious they were. Whatever they learned in Fiji, along with whatever we already knew as warriors and as fighters, he can tell that those guys were well prepared for this battle, for war. How good he was with the spear, how good he was with the club. Finau describes Tupou Niwa and how powerful of a swing he had with his club. How them and their men were fighting, beating down Tukuaho's men, killing them with each stroke and with spears or whatever they were using, stepping over the bodies and continue war, taking it to Tukuaho loyalists. He told Mariner that Tupou Niwa probably killed 30 or 40 guys on his own, along with how vicious him and his men were. Glorious battle that lasted for hours. Finau tells him how they were so close to winning, so close to killing a lot of them. Much of them died. A lot of their own men died, but they were getting closer and closer to victory, to the point where some of the loyalists of Tukuaho started running away. They started turning and running.
And I think more than likely the Tukuaho men would outnumber Tui Halafatai and all these guys, because this is the main island. So it's quite miraculous and probably a testament to the prowess of these Tongans who just came from Fiji, the advanced fighting skills that they had, and also the weaponry probably, was superior to what the typical Tongan was used to back on Tonga at that time.
The ones that were brave enough to stand there stood, and they were dying as they were fighting, and they were killing as well. But Finau can tell that they were close to victory. As soon as Tuihapatai realized that they were so close to victory, Tuihapatai didn't want to go back. He didn't want to go back home and lie in bed and die sick
Stay
in
and
his bed,
fight.
which is
Yeah.
why Tuihapatai ran into a group of the enemy and just started swinging his club away, whoever he can hit, whoever he can stab, whoever he can kill. And while he was in the thick of the battle of the area he ran into, they catch him with a few spears and a few clubs and kill Tuihapatai. And that ends the days of Tuihapatai, the brave warrior, the leader of the Tongan mercenaries that
You have to, and what that type of mentality is something that, we've had on previous podcasts where Polynesians, yes, are very gifted physically. Um, that's one of the biggest things they bring to the table as athletes, especially when they train, they build their knowledge and develop their experience. But one of the things, it's that switch we've mentioned. It's basically that tui halafatai. We're going to call it the tui halafatai switch of there is no turning back. There is only one way, and it's forward, right? And if you make it forward, great, and you survive, great. But there is no turning back. And that is something that can be very powerful, used for positive things, but in the wrong hands or used for the wrong purposes is very powerful, but for the wrong reasons, and can lead to a lot of heartache, pain, and problems. And that's probably the best way to describe it. And we're just going to call it the Tui Halafatai switch moving forward.
were Fiji warriors. They may have been Tongan, but they claimed to be Fijian warriors because of all the things they learned about the Fijian men, the Fijian maxim, Fijian masculinity, the bravery of the Fijians, the warlike manner the Fijians taught them how to use weapons. So although Tuihapatai and his men came from Tonga, they actually promoted themselves and bragged about them being Fijian warriors. But thus ended the days of Tuihapatai. Finau also admitted to Mariner that he may not have fought as viciously and as savagely as Tuihapatai and his men, or Tuponiua and his men, but he kept a steady swing with his club just so that he can get to victory. We kind of know the personality of Finau Ukalala as a politician. He's borderline bloodthirsty, warmongering, but for power, for anarchy. He wanted to be in power. He had his own reasons, his own motives of why he wanted Tuponiua to take out Tukuaho. And a lot of it had to do with power, and we're going to see that in the future of this book too. After those 2 to 4 hours of that battle and them chasing them off and them running off where they get back into their canoes and they sail from Hihifo back into Hahake, and they get together and they meet and they basically decide, let's go back to Hapai, let's go back to Lava'u, as long as we got the main group of Tukuaho, because a lot of them were fighting just because they were loyal to Tukuaho or loyal to the family or had loyal friends in noble callings. But just like I said before, for the most part, a lot of people didn't like him because he was a bully, because he was a tyrant. But they felt satisfied that most of the ones who were close to Tuaho are gone now. And because that's the case, Tonga started dividing itself into different groups, into different tribes and areas, districts, if you will. And everybody started building forts. Everybody started building garrisons of their own.
Now, because of the instability, there's that division, as we mentioned, that's a natural outcome of disorder and disarray and lack of stability. So really, now what we're seeing in Fiji is starting to appear in Tonga.
Mariner said when he was there was probably 14 or 15 forts throughout Tonga since the time they killed Tukuaho just to protect themselves from Finau attacking Tonga annually for power, for anarchy, for monarchy. One thing that Mariner understood is that Finau wants to rule all of Tonga, and he's going to do it one way or another. And in his own opinion, he was trying to do it through combat, through military forces. But that created the divide in Tonga. There were Tu'is in each places, there were Haus in each places. Each place had their own champions, which means each place were telling their own stories. Each place had their stories of who went to war and who won and who they thought should be in power.
Propaganda. We see it today, not just to control people, but also to influence people, um, to pick one side over the other. It's been going on for a long time. Nothing new.
Who they thought should not have been in power. And so those stories go. And so the history goes. And so those stories and histories go from each of those tribes and those districts and those villages and those families. And those are the stories we end up then telling in modern day history, where we have the story once removed from Mariner himself. Finau telling the story, Tuponiwa telling him the story, other chiefs telling him the story. He said he's even talked to Tuitonga. The Tuitonga family at the time was the Fatafehi family. That was the Tuitonga family. Those were the ones that were descended from the gods. All the other Tuis and the house were kings and rulers through military force. Those were the differences. So,
Very interesting. So I'll have to go double check, but that probably means that Tuguaho possibly was the Tuikanukupolu. Um, and so he being the primary, and it could have been the Inasi at that time because the Tuitonga only got involved with the Polo Polo, which is more of a religious offering, and the Inasi is a tax, which is why all these other chiefs were bringing an annual tax or tribute to the Tuikanukupolu, and the Tuitonga being separate on the east part of the island in Mua. So really interesting. Appreciate Kawa University again for making this series, and really some good insights. One of the interesting things here is we're starting to see the chaos that's coming about now that we see that the Tuikanukupolu was at that height of influence, basically the administrative arm of the Tuitonga and the Tuihatakalaua. But this delegation of authority and work has resulted in the Tuikanukupolu having significant power, right, and influence to the point where the Tuikanukupolu is feeling like they can do whatever they want. I was thinking at first it was the Tuitonga, and it was that separation um, from the people that led to the type of behavior, but it looks like it was the Tuikanukupolu, and I guess just the overexertion of military and hard power that led to the dysfunction and to the eventual instability of society that leads to war, um, and leads to the point where there are just non-stop assassinations and battles moving forward. So once again, appreciate everyone. If you find any value, please like, a share, a subscription goes a long way for us. So we're excited to continue. We'll add this to our series, and we'll continue to return to Kawa University to react as he gets back into the main narrative of William Mariner and his experience in Tonga. Once again, ask the bold questions and stay curious. Peace.